An anonymous 5-second audio clip nearly shattered Jasmine Crockett's reputation and career. But with calm precision and every word weighed like steel, just 5 minutes later, she made veteran Chief Justice John Roberts admit, "I've been wrong for 30 years. The question is no longer whether Jasmine was right. It's this. How many others never got the chance to prove they were?" Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The wind howled through the stone steps of Summit Heights Federal Courthouse, sharp and merciless. Jasmine Crockett walked in alone. No lawyer, no staff, just a black coat and a folder clutched tightly in her hand. She looked like someone entering enemy territory, not a courtroom. Inside, every seat was filled, not for justice, but for a downfall. Reporters, senators, lobbyists, they weren't there to listen. They were there to watch her break. The cameras were already aimed at the defense table, lights harsh and unblinking. No one greeted her. No one smiled. In their eyes, the verdict was written before she spoke a word. But Jasmine didn't flinch, because she didn't come to be liked. She came to be heard. The room had barely settled after Jasmine took her seat when the sound hit, the long, hollow creak of the chamber doors opening. It wasn't loud, but it was commanding. Conversations halted. Pens stopped scratching. Even the photographers lowered their cameras for a moment, as if by instinct. And then he appeared. Chief Justice John Roberts. Every inch of his presence was engineered for control. His robe immaculately pressed, his gait slow but purposeful, his expression unreadable except for one thing. This was a man used to being the final word in every room he walked into. His footsteps echoed down the aisle with the calm menace of someone who didn't need to raise his voice to silence a crowd. It wasn't noise that gave him authority. It was the air he seemed to suck out of the room with every step. When he reached the bench, he paused, not because he needed to, but because he wanted the silence to stretch. His eyes moved methodically, scanning the courtroom like a general surveying a battlefield. Then they landed on Jasmine and stayed there. Something flickered across his face. Not anger, not disgust, but something colder. Recognition. Not of her as an equal, but as a disruption. The kind of voice he had spent a career outmaneuvering. A young black woman who had dared to speak clearly, without apology, in front of microphones he believed belonged to his world, not hers. He adjusted his glasses with 2 fingers, leaned forward slightly, and delivered the blow. Not shouted, but sharpened. "Ms. Crockett, this is a courtroom, not a stage for political theater." It was delivered like a punch wrapped in velvet, a smirk without a smile, and it landed exactly how he intended. The gallery responded instantly, chuckles at first, then a slow ripple of laughter, dry and deliberate, as if permission had just been granted to mock her. Some journalists glanced at one another, eyebrows raised, not because they were shocked, but because they'd been waiting for it. Others didn't even pretend to hide their amusement. It wasn't just disrespect, it was expectation. The room was still buzzing from the judge's remark when Elliot Drayton rose from his seat. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. Everything about his demeanor said one thing: control. His suit was flawlessly pressed, his silver tie pin catching just enough light to make him look important, but never flashy. He approached the center of the courtroom like it was a stage he had rehearsed on for years, and in truth he had. Elliot wasn't just a lawyer, he was a federal tactician, trained not only in law but in optics. He adjusted his cuffs, cleared his throat once, and began, voice calm and precise. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court," he said, turning to the jury with the confidence of someone who assumed belief would follow presence. "This isn't a case about freedom of speech. This is a case about power, about what happens when someone trusted to inform the public uses that trust to push a political message." He let that sink in, paced 2 steps, then turned sharply to face Jasmine. Ms. Crockett, standing at the official White House podium, looked into cameras watched by millions and said something no government official should ever say on the taxpayer's time. He walked to the prosecution table and picked up a document, pristine, tabbed, highlighted. On February 15th, these were her exact words: "They deserve it. Anyone who opposes America deserves what's coming." He paused, holding the silence like a weapon. Not a policy update, not a statistic. That is a threat. That is political aggression wrapped in patriotic language. The impact was immediate and visceral, a sharp intake of breath from the second row. Pens froze mid-word. One woman covered her mouth. In the back, a younger aide whispered something to a senior senator and nodded. A few journalists glanced at one another, their expressions a mix of intrigue and calculation. And somewhere, someone smirked. Because that was the moment they'd been waiting for. The quote that could be twisted into narrative, weaponized into guilt. Drayton knew that. He knew he didn't need context to win that moment. All he needed was momentum. He stepped forward again, slowly, directing the court's attention back to the highlighted text in his hand. This is not public service. This is not what we pay federal employees to do. That's not leadership, it's campaign talk. And we all know it. His tone sharpened, no longer cold but edged with moral outrage. The Hatch Act was written for this exact kind of abuse. Because when people in power use their position to shape public opinion for political gain, even subtly, it chips away at democracy. And if we don't call it out when we see it, we're saying it's okay. He turned back to the judge now, voice firm, clear. The law doesn't care what party she belongs to. It cares about action. And Ms. Crockett crossed the line. But Drayton wasn't finished. The quote had landed like a punch, but he was just getting started. He walked slowly back to the prosecution table, each step deliberate, his expression calm but calculated. He knew how to handle silence, how to stretch it, fill it, control it. Without a word, he opened his briefcase and reached inside. His hand came out holding a small silver USB drive. No label, no markings. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply turned toward the judge, held it up like a loaded weapon and said, "Your Honor, the prosecution has received an additional piece of evidence this morning, a recording, submitted anonymously. We don't know the source or the full chain of custody, but what we do know is that in this clip, Ms. Crockett can be clearly heard saying the same words you just heard in court. And even more than that," he paused, not because he forgot what to say, but because he wanted the words to settle into every ear, every notebook, every whispered conversation. "Same press briefing, off mic but clear," he added, unfiltered. Then he placed the drive on the evidence table like it was a live grenade. The moment hung in the air. Then it snapped. Gasps cut through the courtroom. Someone near the back actually said, "Oh my God," loud enough to be heard. Several jurors turned to one another, eyebrows raised, posture stiffening. A veteran journalist mouthed, "That's it." The judge leaned forward slightly, hands steepled. Reporters began scribbling. Some who had shown up to witness a fall from grace now looked convinced they were watching it in real time. The audio, now playing on courtroom speakers, captured Jasmine's voice saying, "They deserve it. Anyone who opposes America deserves what's coming, and maybe now they'll finally shut up and listen." It was her tone, measured, confident, unfiltered, that made it hit harder. There was no screaming, no sarcasm, just a quiet certainty that, played without context, sounded dangerously absolute. All at once, the entire room shifted. What had been doubt turned into suspicion. What started as political drama was beginning to feel more serious, more dangerous. Jasmine, still sitting at the defense table, could feel the air grow heavier around her, not just with tension, but with something worse, disbelief. She knew exactly how risky anonymous evidence could be. She knew how easily a 5-second audio clip, cut out of context, could be turned into a weapon. And in this courtroom, truth suddenly didn't matter as much as how the truth appeared. And the way it appeared was bad. Now every eye was on her, not because of what she said, but because, for the first time, it seemed like someone else was speaking on her behalf. But Jasmine didn't move, not to explain, not to protest. She sat still, hands calmly folded, as if the storm around her was happening in a different room. Her stillness wasn't surrender, it was discipline. She had seen this tactic before. Overwhelm, corner, then wait for the collapse. But she didn't give them the collapse. She gave them silence and let them sit in it. Until finally Judge Roberts looked up and said evenly, "Ms. Crockett, your response?" The moment snapped into slow motion. She stood, not quickly, not hesitantly, but with a kind of quiet gravity that pulled every eye toward her. Her shoulders square, chin high. She didn't clear her throat or adjust her blouse. She didn't shuffle papers or fidget. She simply stood there unflinching and waited until the room went completely still. Then she spoke, and her voice didn't rise. It didn't shake, and it didn't ask for permission. If this is a dress rehearsal for political theater, then the prosecution deserves a standing ovation. Truly, their timing, their drama, their delivery, it's flawless. She paused, not for effect, but for honesty. Then her tone cooled. But the only problem is, this isn't a theater, this is a courtroom, and I didn't come here to perform. I came here to deal in facts. That was it, just one breath of words, but it hit harder than the anonymous recording. Because Jasmine hadn't argued, she hadn't shouted, she hadn't begged, she'd simply clarified. And the effect was instant. The laughter stopped, the whispering halted. Even the judge leaned back slightly, as if re-evaluating her all over again. She didn't smile, she didn't gloat. She just stood in the silence she had created, and for the first time that morning, it was the prosecution, not the defense, who looked unsure. The silence she created didn't fade, it deepened. Jasmine took one slow breath and stepped forward, the folder still in her hands. But this time, it wasn't a shield, it was a scalpel. "Your Honor, members of the jury," she began, her voice low but unmistakably firm. "We've heard accusations, we've seen headlines, we've even listened to an anonymous clip. But here's what we haven't done yet. Something basic, something essential. Read the actual law." She turned the folder outward, revealing a printed copy of the Hatch Act, bold text underlined and highlighted. "This is the statute the prosecution says I broke. It's short, clear. It says, a federal employee may not use their official authority or influence for the purpose of interfering with or affecting the result of an election." She looked at each juror as she repeated it, slowly, cleanly, not to criticize a trade policy, not to speak on camera, not to share federal data, only if the purpose is to influence an election. She took a step closer to the jury box, calm and measured. "Let's talk about February 15th, the day of that press briefing. Was there an election coming up? No. Were there campaign events underway? No. Did I tell anyone to vote for a candidate? Did I name a campaign? Ask for money? Issue an endorsement?" She shook her head, just once. "No, I stood at a podium, as part of my job, and answered a question about trade tariffs, using government-released numbers." She paused, letting the simplicity of that statement land. "I didn't hold a rally. I didn't push a slogan. I didn't say, vote Republican. I didn't say, support the president. I said our northern trade rivals were struggling under U.S. tariffs, which was true based on the Commerce Department's own findings. I said those who oppose American trade policy should expect consequences. And then I added a sentence that didn't make it into the prosecution's exhibit." Her voice didn't rise, but it gained weight. "I said, and I quote, but our job is to lead, not to gloat." The room shifted again, heads tilted. Pens hovered in the air. She wasn't speaking emotionally. She wasn't even angry. She was just right, and she knew it. "This case isn't about legality," she continued. "It's about discomfort. It's about tone. It's about the idea that someone like me, someone who speaks directly, someone who doesn't soften the truth, must be doing something wrong." She glanced toward the prosecution table, because when they couldn't find a donation, couldn't find a campaign, couldn't find a slogan, they found a tone they didn't like and called it illegal. She held up the law again. But the Hatch Act doesn't care about tone. It cares about action. It cares about intent. And if we start prosecuting based on how someone sounds, instead of what they actually did, then this courtroom isn't upholding the law. It's performing a trial of personality. Jasmine looked back to the jury now, both hands lowered at her sides. No theatrics, just one woman, standing alone, asking them to listen not with suspicion, but with reason. "You don't have to agree with my delivery, but I ask you to measure it against the law. The real law. The one written on this page. Not the one the headlines have imagined. Not the one the prosecution wishes it were. She paused, then added simply, because the difference between discomfort and illegality is everything. She let her previous words settle like dust in still air, then slowly returned to the defense table. Her movements were calm, methodical, deliberate. She opened the folder again, this time revealing a thicker document, about 10 pages, neatly printed, tabbed in yellow and blue with an official White House watermark on the corner. She held it up, not dramatically but clearly, and looked straight at the jury. What I'm holding, she said, is the full transcript of the press briefing in question, the one I delivered on February 15th. Not a clip, not an excerpt, the full record. Verified by the Office of Government Communications and archived by the National Press Database. She stepped forward, walking slowly toward the jury box as she handed a copy to the court clerk. You're going to see this with your own eyes, because I want you to see it. I need you to see it. Not because I'm asking for sympathy, but because this is how easily the truth gets twisted when someone wants to turn it into a weapon. She turned to the judge. Your Honor, I ask that page 3, line 14, be read aloud for the record. There was a pause. The courtroom waited. The clerk flipped through the pages. Then came the sentence, spoken clearly into the microphone. Some might say they deserve the economic consequences of opposing our trade policy, but our job is to lead, not to gloat. Jasmine stood still, then slowly turned back to face the jury. That's what I said, she continued, her voice calm but ironclad. That's the sentence they didn't include. That's the context they erased. The sentence that turned a political attack into a policy explanation. She raised her hand slightly, not to silence the room, but to draw its attention. I was asked a question about the effectiveness of tariffs. I answered with data, and I added a statement about responsibility, about restraint, about leadership. She paused, letting the words hang in the stillness. And what did they do with that? She asked. They took the middle of my answer, cut off the beginning, erased the ending, then held it up to the jury as if it were a smoking gun. Not because it was illegal, but because it was easy to manipulate. She now walked the length of the jury box, slowly, with a folded copy of the transcript in hand. I didn't break the law. I did my job. I briefed the press. I answered questions. I used facts that had been published by our own federal agencies. And yes, I spoke directly. I didn't sugarcoat. I didn't play soft. But I never, not once, asked for votes. I didn't name a candidate. I didn't say, support the president. I said we're leading a tough trade policy. I said it was working. And then I said the part that mattered most. Our job is to lead, not to gloat. Her voice didn't waver. It didn't need to. That line didn't fit their narrative, so they cut it out. She looked back at the prosecution table. They brought you 5 seconds. I brought you 5 pages. They brought you suspicion. I brought you a certified transcript. She held up the document again, not for drama, but for emphasis. If what I said was so damaging, why did they have to hide half of it? She gave the jurors just enough time to absorb the full transcript before turning toward the prosecution table and the USB drive still sitting there like a loaded trap. Her voice didn't change in volume, but it cooled in tone, gaining weight. Now, she said, walking slowly across the courtroom floor, let's talk about the audio file. The 5-second clip that was somehow dramatic enough to alter the mood of this entire courtroom. She stopped and looked directly at the jury, her voice precise and unshaking. You heard it. You saw how quickly everything turned. But no one has asked the most basic question yet. Where did it come from? She raised the official evidence log in her hand. Let me read what we know, she continued. It arrived in the prosecution's inbox at 7:14 a.m. this morning. No name, no return address, no affidavit, no timestamp metadata, no chain of custody, no indication of who recorded it, when it was recorded, or if it's even authentic. She lowered the paper slowly. It could have come from a bystander with a grudge. It could have been edited. It could have been fabricated. And yet it was played in this courtroom, treated like it carried the same weight as a sworn affidavit. She turned toward the judge now. Your Honor, in any other courtroom in this country, a piece of evidence without source, without verification, and without context would be thrown out before it touched the record. She glanced back toward the jury. But here, it's treated as a turning point. Then she walked forward, standing closer to the jurors than before, close enough to speak plainly as one citizen to another. Imagine someone accused you of a crime. Then imagine the only evidence was a 5-second voicemail. No date, no location, no witness to confirm it. Just 5 words cut in the middle of a sentence, played back with no explanation. Would you call that justice? She let the question hang, raw and rhetorical. No one moved. She looked each juror in the eye. Her voice dropped, not for effect, but for clarity. So let me ask it another way. When you take away the context, the authentication, the origin, when there's nothing left but 5 seconds of sound from a mystery source, what do we call that? She paused, let the room inhale, and delivered the final blow like a scalpel. Do we call it evidence? Or do we call it what it really is? A trap? The silence that followed wasn't confused. It wasn't tense. It was unnerved. Because in that moment, Jasmine had reframed everything. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't accused. She had simply asked the one question no one else had dared to say out loud. Is this about truth? Or is this about tactics? And suddenly, the burden wasn't just on her anymore. It was on the court. The room was still processing her last question when Jasmine stepped away from the jury. She didn't retreat to her table. She didn't pause to gather herself. Instead, she walked, slow, steady, deliberate, toward the front of the courtroom, toward the bench, toward the man whose silence had held more weight than any ruling yet spoken. She stopped just feet away from Chief Justice Roberts, and then she looked directly into his eyes. She didn't blink, didn't lower her gaze. Her voice, when it came, didn't tremble. It carried, low and sharp like a blade. Your Honor, she began, her tone controlled but unmistakably defiant. If an audio file with no author, no metadata, and no verification can be submitted as evidence, then this isn't a court of law. This is a stage, a political stage, dressed in robes and gavel, where suspicion replaces proof and perception replaces precedent. A ripple moved through the gallery, small but undeniable. A few heads turned. One juror shifted in their seat, but Jasmine didn't break eye contact with the judge. She let that moment hang in the air, not as a plea, but as a warning. Then slowly and without ceremony, she reached back into her folder and pulled out one final document. It was thinner than the others, only 2 pages. But she held it with the care of someone handling a live wire. She placed it on the edge of the podium and tapped once, softly. This, she said, is the ruling in Jenkins v. U.S. Civil Ethics Commission, 2018. A real case, a real precedent, and one this courtroom is dangerously close to violating. Her voice stayed level, but her pace quickened just slightly because now she wasn't defending herself. She was prosecuting the misuse of the law itself. In Jenkins, she continued, a federal employee was accused of violating the Hatch Act after speaking at a community event where the word leadership was interpreted as political endorsement. The Ethics Commission moved forward, the defense pushed back, and the court ruled unanimously that, in the absence of direct or demonstrable linkage to an election or candidate, expression of opinion alone does not constitute a violation of the Hatch Act. She let that sink in. No candidate mentioned. No election affected, no campaign promoted, and the court threw it out. Because the Hatch Act is not about tone, it's not about opinion, it's about influence over an electoral outcome. That's not just my argument, that's established law. Jasmine's tone darkened, not with anger, but with conviction. But instead of honoring that precedent, the prosecution clipped 5 seconds from a 20-minute briefing and called it a violation. And now they want this court to accept an anonymous recording, no source, no signature, as evidence. Why? Because it feels suspicious, because it sounds aggressive, because it looks bad. She stepped forward, closer to the bench now, still calm but visibly resolute. But courts do not rule on feelings. They rule on facts. They do not prosecute discomfort. They prosecute violations. And I refuse, respectfully, firmly, and unapologetically, to stand here and allow precedent to be ignored for the sake of political theater. The courtroom was dead silent. You could hear the faint buzz of a camera shutter and the subtle creak of someone shifting in the gallery. But no one spoke. No one dared. She leaned in, just slightly, and looked the judge square in the face. So I ask this court a final question. If the Hatch Act is to mean anything, shouldn't it be applied as written, as ruled? Or are we rewriting it here today, on the fly, because a 5-second clip made the wrong people uncomfortable? She didn't wait for a response. Instead, she turned back toward the gallery, then toward the jury box. You want to know what makes a real violation dangerous? She said, voice rising by only a fraction. It's not a strong opinion in a press room. It's bending the law around political optics. It's turning a courtroom into a PR event. It's accepting evidence that wouldn't pass basic journalistic standards, let alone legal ones. She pointed toward the USB drive again. If that's admissible, then none of us are safe. If that is enough to question someone's loyalty, someone's integrity, then every civil servant in this country is one clip sentence away from prosecution. A soft murmur broke out in the back rows. Not disrespectful, not dismissive, but something else entirely. Agreement, understanding, recognition, and Jasmine felt it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't move a muscle out of place. She just let the truth do what it always does when given room to breathe. It cut through noise like light through fog. Law doesn't belong to whoever shouts the loudest, she said, voice returning to a whisper. It belongs to those who uphold it, even when it's inconvenient. She took one final breath. And right now, I am not asking this court for sympathy. I am not asking to be liked. I am not even asking to be believed at face value. I'm asking for one thing, to be judged by the law, not by speculation, not by pressure, not by a whisper campaign wrapped in a flash drive. She stepped back finally, her arms lowered, her folder closed. And in that moment, for the first time since the trial had begun, the courtroom did not look at Jasmine as a defendant. They looked at her as a force, calm, grounded, in full command of the Constitution they were all sworn to uphold. And this time, even Chief Justice Roberts didn't have a word to say. The last words from Jasmine hadn't echoed. They had landed, heavy, unshakable. And then, silence. A silence so absolute it seemed to press against the walls of the courtroom like soundproof padding. No one moved. Not the reporters with pens frozen mid-sentence. Not the jurors with transcripts halfway turned. Not even the cameras, which had stopped clicking as if the room itself was holding its breath. The moment was brittle, fragile, like one false word could shatter it. Chief Justice Roberts leaned back in his chair slowly, his eyes never leaving Jasmine for a long beat. Then, without a word, he reached for the printed transcript she had submitted, the one marked in yellow and annotated in blue ink, the one the prosecution had conveniently summarized but never presented in full. He didn't scan it like a man looking for an excuse. He read it like someone reading it for the first time, not just with his eyes, but with a mind trying to catch up to something it had already dismissed. His fingers moved across the page slowly, pausing at the critical line. But our job is to lead, not to gloat. His brow tightened, not in anger, but in recognition. And for the first time all morning, the stern mask he wore began to show signs of wear. He adjusted his glasses, exhaled, and turned his attention across the aisle. Mr. Drayton, he said, softly, but with something harder underneath. Can you verify the origin of the audio clip submitted this morning? The question hit the prosecutor like a subtle strike to the ribs. Drayton, who had just an hour ago commanded the courtroom with flawless posture and courtroom charisma, now hesitated, just long enough for everyone to notice. He cleared his throat. Your Honor, we received the file from an anonymous source. That was all he said, but it was everything. There was no need for cross-examination, no need for raised voices or objections. The weight of what wasn't said, no source, no chain of custody, no confirmation, did all the damage for him. A ripple passed through the jury box and then through the gallery like a shifting wind. It wasn't drama. It was something colder. Realization. Chief Justice Roberts didn't speak right away. He didn't have to. His silence said more than any ruling. He leaned forward again, elbows on the bench, transcript still in hand, and looked back down. Not at Jasmine, not at Drayton, but at the words on the page in front of him. And you could see it, the recalibration, the reassessment, the shift from doubt to scrutiny, but not aimed at the defendant this time. Jasmine stood still, not triumphant, but rooted. Her hands were calm at her sides. She didn't smile. She didn't smirk, because she knew this wasn't a victory. It was clarity. She had forced the system to pause, to think, and sometimes that was louder than any declaration. Drayton tried to recover. While the source was anonymous, Your Honor, the contents of the audio, but Roberts raised one finger. Not a gesture of silence, just caution, precision, authority. That's enough, Mr. Drayton, he said, his voice sharper now. Let's not pretend what this court already knows. A file with no author, no validation, introduced on the morning of trial. He shook his head slowly. You're asking this court to treat hearsay as foundation. That's not how this works. Not here. The room had fallen into a silence so deep it felt physical, like a blanket laid over every breath. Even the ever-clicking cameras were still now, as if they understood instinctively that no sound should break what was coming. Chief Justice John Roberts remained still for a long moment, his fingertips pressed lightly against the edges of the bench, gaze resting not on the prosecution, not on the jury, but on Jasmine. She had returned to her seat, calm, still, not triumphant, but composed. She had not made a single gesture since she stepped back. Not a breath wasted, not a glance given to the crowd. She had said what needed to be said, and now she waited for the law to decide whether it still meant anything. Roberts finally shifted, slowly. He removed his glasses and placed them down beside the transcript on the bench. The gesture was small, but it sent a wave of anticipation across the courtroom. The man who had presided over dozens, maybe hundreds, of high-profile trials now looked heavier, not tired, but burdened, not by confusion, but by understanding. He leaned forward, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter than expected. Lower, more personal. Ms. Crockett. He stopped, letting the words settle, then tried again. When this case was first assigned to my docket, I prepared myself to hear what I assumed would be a carefully managed political performance. I thought I'd be listening to a deflection, a reframe, perhaps even a calculated defense crafted more for public opinion than legal substance. Another pause. His eyes stayed on her. But you forced me to relearn my own understanding of the law I've been sworn to uphold for over 3 decades. No one moved. Not a breath escaped. Even the court clerk had stopped typing, hands hovering above the keys. Roberts reached again for the transcript and held it lightly in his fingers, like it carried the weight of something far greater than paper. You reminded this court, he continued, that the Hatch Act was not designed to police language, but to protect elections. It was written to prevent coercion, manipulation, the misuse of public office to influence democratic outcomes, not to punish public servants for delivering uncomfortable truths. He turned to face the courtroom now, not just the jury, but the entire room. His voice regained its judicial clarity, firmer, clearer. The prosecution's case relied heavily, if not entirely, on a short, isolated statement made during a legally sanctioned press briefing, a statement which, when viewed in full context, does not meet the threshold of unlawful political activity. The court finds no explicit endorsement, no implied campaign coordination, no misuse of authority for electoral influence. Then his voice cooled, and the next words landed like a stone dropped into water. Furthermore, the late submission of an audio clip of anonymous origin, lacking any verifiable chain of custody or metadata, does not satisfy the requirements for admissible evidence in federal court. There it was. It wasn't loud. It wasn't shouted. But it was the gavel drop before the gavel. Reporters looked at one another. Jurors subtly exhaled. Jasmine didn't move. Robert straightened slightly, now visibly finished with his internal debate. This court hereby rules that the submitted recording is inadmissible and that the defense, Ms. Jasmine Crockett, has not violated any provision of the Hatch Act. He leaned back in his chair. The decision had been rendered. The pressure had lifted. And yet, he wasn't done. His gaze returned to Jasmine one final time, not as a judge to a defendant, but as a man speaking to someone who had forced him to confront the rust on his own understanding of justice. "And one more thing, Ms. Crockett," he said, voice lower now, more personal again. "You've made me reconsider how I've interpreted this statute, not just today, but over the course of 30 years on this bench. You've reminded me that clarity is not always comfortable, and that truth doesn't always come from where we expect." Another pause. No one interrupted. No one dared to. "I came into this courtroom expecting to teach, but today I leave it having learned." He lifted the gavel, not quickly, not theatrically, and brought it down once with a single decisive bang. "This case is dismissed." For a moment the room did not erupt. It didn't know how. The silence that followed wasn't confused or relieved. It was reverent, as if something larger than a legal decision had just happened, as if they had just witnessed not a courtroom victory, but a recalibration of the justice system itself. And Jasmine? She didn't smile. She didn't pump a fist. She didn't look at the reporters scrambling to file their headlines or the aides whispering into phones. She reached down, quietly gathered her documents, closed the folder that had held her life for weeks, and stood. Straight, quiet, still. Because this moment wasn't about celebration. It was about proving something sacred could still be defended. And today she had done just that, with law, not volume, with facts, not fear. And with one final glance toward the empty center of the courtroom, she turned and walked away from the defense table, not as someone who had survived the process, but as someone who had redefined it. The gavel had fallen. The court was dismissed. But for several long seconds, no one stood. The room remained locked in that rare, sacred stillness that follows something irreversible. A verdict that didn't just close a case, but opened eyes. Jasmine didn't move right away. She stayed seated for one beat longer than expected. Not out of hesitation, but intention. She knew that this silence, the one she had earned through clarity, not combat, was worth honoring. Then with quiet certainty, she rose. No handshakes, no cheers, no legal team wrapping her in congratulations. Just her. The folder that had carried her defense now tucked under one arm, the same way she had carried it in. She walked toward the double doors, not with pride, but with purpose. Her heels echoed across the floor like punctuation. Behind her, the courtroom began to stir. Papers rustling, seats shifting, reporters whispering into microphones. But none of it touched her. The moment she stepped past the threshold and onto the granite steps of the courthouse, the chaos hit like a wave. "Ms. Crockett! Jasmine, over here! Can you confirm, was that an official rebuke of the Hatch Act?" The press had swarmed early. Satellite vans lined the curb. Camera lenses pointed like weapons. Journalists stood shoulder to shoulder, elbows locked, shouting over one another with questions that sounded more like accusations. Flashes erupted. Boom mics dangled. Live feeds rolled. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She stepped down slowly, her gaze forward, her spine unshaken by the noise. Reporters pushed in tighter, voices climbing over each other, and then one broke through clearly. "Ms. Crockett, would you call this a political victory?" Jasmine stopped. Just one step above the crowd, she turned, not quickly but with intent, and looked directly into the nearest camera lens. Her expression was unreadable. Not cold, not emotional, just firm, real. And then she answered. "No," she said, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade through silk. "This is not a political victory. This is a victory for principle." The crowd fell quiet for a moment, just long enough to hear it. She didn't elaborate. She didn't spin. She didn't repackage it for sound bites. She let those 10 words stand on their own, because they were enough, because they had to be. And then, just like that, she turned and kept walking. Not into a motorcade, not toward a podium, just forward, past the cameras, past the chaos, past the attempts to twist the truth she had just untangled. She didn't walk fast. She didn't need to. She had said everything she came to say in the courtroom, and again, right here. Now it was their turn to process it, their turn to catch up, their turn to answer the questions still echoing through their own headlines. Behind her, the reporters buzzed again, trying to parse the meaning of her answer, rushing to file their reactions, tweeting words like landmark, defiant, historic. But none of that was for her. She wasn't performing for cameras. She never had been. That was the part they still didn't understand. Because what had just happened wasn't made for politics. It was made for the record. One block away, the air was quieter. The noise didn't follow her. Not really. She paused at a crosswalk, looking up at the light. Not as a symbol, not as a metaphor, just as a person deciding whether to wait or walk. Someone across the street recognized her. A man in his 60s, suit jacket folded over one arm, briefcase in the other. He didn't call her name. He didn't take out a phone. He just nodded. Once, slow and deliberate. Jasmine nodded back. Just slightly. That was enough. By the time she reached the parking lot, the SUV was already waiting. A single staffer, one of the only people on her team who hadn't abandoned her when the indictment dropped, opened the rear door. "Are you okay?" the staffer asked gently. Jasmine didn't answer right away. She slid into the seat, set the folder beside her, and buckled her seatbelt. Then she looked out the window, not back toward the courthouse, but toward the horizon line beyond the city. "I'm not sure that's the right question," she finally said. The staffer hesitated. "Then what is?" Jasmine turned, her voice quieter now, but still unwavering. "The question isn't whether I'm okay. It's whether the system is." The staffer nodded slowly, then closed the door. Back inside the courthouse, Robert sat alone at the bench. The room had cleared, but he remained seated, still holding the now wrinkled transcript in his hands. He read it one more time. Not because he needed to, but because he couldn't quite believe how close they had come to rewriting the law based on tone, not action. He wasn't proud of the assumption he had made at the start, but he was grateful, quietly, heavily, that Jasmine Crockett had proven him wrong. Back at headquarters, newsrooms were already firing on all cylinders. "Clip her answer from the courthouse steps. Tag it with principle," one producer barked. "Get the Hatch Act ruling to our legal analysts," another snapped. "Is this precedent? Is the act outdated? Did a 33-year-old just teach the Chief Justice his own job?" Jasmine's face appeared across cable news banners. Not smiling, not waving, just still, facing the press, answering with that one line that didn't fit into any political box. This is a victory for principle. And suddenly people were listening, not just to her, but to the question behind her words. What does it mean when clarity is louder than power? What happens when the system expects a collapse and gets the Constitution instead? At that same hour, in homes across the country, retired veterans, civic teachers, former clerks, old reporters, watched the clip not once, but twice. Not because they didn't understand it the first time, but because they hadn't expected to hear it at all. And somewhere, one of them said quietly to his wife, "She didn't just win. She reminded them what the law's for." The wife nodded, blinking hard. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett sat in the back seat of a dark SUV. The city passed outside her window in flashes, concrete and glass and shadow. She said nothing. The staffer didn't interrupt, and the folder beside her remained closed. But inside her, the fire hadn't dimmed. It hadn't even cooled. It had just changed shape. Because this wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of a new kind of conversation, one where facts had to matter again, one where silence, when used right, could be stronger than the loudest lie, one where the law was a shield, not a stage. And Jasmine Crockett had made that clear, not by overpowering the court, but by reminding it what it was meant to protect. She hadn't said much when she walked out of that courthouse. Just 10 words. 10 calm, razor-edged words that no one saw coming. This is not a political victory. This is a victory for principle. But sometimes it only takes 10 words to ignite a fire. The clip hit social media less than 7 minutes after she left the steps. Someone caught the moment from a shaky phone cam, posted it raw, with no edits, no filters, just Jasmine Crockett, alone, surrounded by chaos, saying what the whole system had refused to say out loud. The caption read, "She didn't flinch. She didn't gloat. She told the truth." It started slow. A few hundred shares, a handful of comments, a few journalists on Twitter quoting the line with hashtags like #voice of reason and #Jasmine was right. But by nightfall, it was no longer just another clip in the churn of daily outrage. It had become something else entirely. Cable networks aired the footage in full, no interruptions, no spin, just her voice against the roar of reporters. Legal analysts, left, right, and center, paused their usual sound bites to say something they hadn't said in a long time. That was a masterclass in constitutional law. By the next morning, the hashtags had taken on lives of their own. Voice of reason trended across 4 continents. Modernize the Hatch Act surged as think tanks, law professors, and ethics commissions began revisiting case law in real time. And Jasmine was right. That one wasn't trending because of lawyers. It was trending because of people, teachers, veterans, nurses, factory workers, people who had been told their voice didn't matter and had just watched someone use hers like a scalpel against the very machinery that tried to crush her. Clips flooded TikTok, Instagram, X, and even corners of the internet usually immune to political noise. One showed Jasmine's final words to the judge overlaid with audio from JFK's inauguration. Another edited her turning from the microphones in slow motion with no music, just the sound of silence before a movement begins. But it wasn't just admiration, it was awakening. In comment sections beneath major media posts, users began asking questions no pundit had prepared for. What is the Hatch Act, exactly? Why does the law let tone be treated like proof? How many others have been silenced by rules that were never meant to punish clarity? And beneath those were thousands of variations of the same comment. I'm not political, but I know truth when I hear it. At a university law class in Boston, a professor scrapped his syllabus and played the full trial footage. He didn't ask them to analyze the ruling. He asked them to analyze her restraint. In a veterans hall in Fort Worth, an old sergeant stood up and told the room, "That woman didn't argue. She stood." That's what courage actually looks like. A high school civics teacher in Michigan asked his students to watch the clip, then write a 1-page response to the question, "What does principle mean when no one else is clapping?" But the most unexpected voice came from a place Jasmine never thought she'd reach. A retired federal judge from South Carolina, someone who had once publicly criticized her lack of decorum, wrote an op-ed titled, "I Misjudged Jasmine Crockett and the Law." In it, he wrote, "It is not often that one trial resets the compass, but this one did." And Ms. Crockett reminded us, some with robes and gavels included, that the purpose of law is not to protect comfort, it is to protect fairness. That op-ed alone was shared over 500,000 times in 3 days. Still, Jasmine never posted about the trial. No tweets, no interviews, no late-night monologues. She let the words she had already spoken continue doing their work, out in the open, where they were needed more than her presence. She wasn't interested in riding the wave. She was interested in making sure it didn't disappear when the headlines faded, because she knew what the system often forgot. Momentum is not change. Awareness is not reform, but clarity, sustained clarity, that's how laws get rewritten. And now, for the first time in decades, someone had made the country want to read the fine print. All because one woman refused to accept a distorted version of justice, and instead, line by line, page by page, sentence by steady sentence. She told the truth, and the truth caught fire. The hashtags hadn't faded. If anything, they had multiplied, spilling across platforms and timelines in ways no campaign manager, no media consultant, no partisan strategist could have predicted. People weren't just reposting Jasmine's word, they were owning them, repeating them at town halls, printing them on protest signs, quoting her in academic lectures and church sermons. This is a victory for principle. 10 words that somehow held the weight of a generation's frustration. But amid the storm of trending clips and cable punditry, One quiet envelope arrived at a downtown Washington office. Hand-addressed, stamped, no return email, no hashtag, just an old-fashioned letter. Inside was a single piece of paper, faded lines, neatly written in blue ink, a signature at the bottom, Thomas McAllister, U.S. Army retired, Fort Hood, Texas. Dear Ms. Crockett, I served in Vietnam in 1970. Lost 2 men in my platoon to an ambush we never saw coming. When I came home, I was told my fight was over. But lately, watching what's happened in this country, I wonder if it ever really ended. I've spent years watching people twist the flag into something it's not, watching the law used as a weapon, not a shield, and watching good people get steamrolled because they spoke too clearly for the comfort of those in power. But then I watched your trial, and I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Someone who stood alone, not to provoke, not to perform, but to protect something real. I once fought with a rifle. You fought with your mind, and you won. Thank you for reminding the rest of us what service still looks like. Respectfully, Sergeant Thomas McAllister, Ret. The staffer who opened the letter didn't speak for a full minute, just held it, then quietly slipped it into a protective sleeve and placed it in Jasmine's inbox. But that letter was more than a thank you. It was a signal. Because within days, professors were citing her arguments in constitutional law seminars. Civic organizations were requesting interviews, not with Jasmine, but with ethics scholars asking, can the Hatch Act still serve its purpose in an age of viral communication? And on Capitol Hill, the ripple hit harder than anyone expected. Senator Elena Ortega of Colorado stood on the Senate floor 3 days after the ruling with a printed copy of the trial transcript in her hand. She didn't shout. She didn't grandstand. She simply read aloud Jasmine's line from the stand. The Hatch Act wasn't written to police discomfort. It was written to protect the democratic process. Then she looked up and said, it's time we ask ourselves whether we're still using this law as it was intended, or whether we're using it to silence those who speak without fear. That one sentence made it into committee notes. By the following week, 3 state legislatures had introduced resolutions calling for a review of the Hatch Act's modern application. One called for a bipartisan ethics council to re-examine how influence is defined in the age of live streams and algorithms. Another cited Jenkins v. U.S. Civil Ethics Commission, the very precedent Jasmine had used, as proof that tone was becoming a substitute for action in too many investigations. Think tanks picked it up next. One released a 70-page brief titled, From Law to Leverage, The Chilling Effect of Over-Enforced Neutrality. The preface opened with a line that read, when truth becomes a liability, the law is no longer neutral. It is complicit. On college campuses, panels formed. Student moderators quoted Jasmine's arguments line by line, comparing her closing statements to historical moments like Barbara Jordan's Watergate address or Thurgood Marshall's Brown v. Board argument. They didn't compare content. They compared clarity. They saw in her not just brilliance, but precision, purpose, and restraint. But not all the reactions came from institutions. In living rooms, parents told their children, watch this. This is how you speak when the world expects you to flinch. In VFW halls, veterans replayed the clip with eyes that didn't blink, nodding quietly when Jasmine said, law doesn't belong to whoever shouts the loudest. And in barbershops and book clubs, town halls, and taxicabs, people began asking not just, what did she win, but what are we still getting wrong? Because Jasmine hadn't asked for reform. She hadn't demanded a rewrite. She had simply shown what happens when law is applied without bias and how rare that was becoming. And now a question had begun to echo, not as a partisan demand, but as a quiet collective challenge. Has the law outlived its language? Jasmine didn't reply to the veteran's letter right away. She read it 3 times before saying a word. Not because she didn't know what to say, but because some words need space to breathe. When she finally did respond, she wrote not from a podium or a press release, but by hand. Dear Sergeant McAllister, I've never carried a weapon, but I've felt the weight of being alone in a room that wanted me to disappear. What you did in the jungle, I will never pretend to understand. But what I tried to do in that courtroom wasn't win. It was protect something bigger than myself. Thank you for seeing that, and thank you for reminding me that even when the battles look different, The duty is the same, to hold the line. With respect, Jasmine Crockett. She never posted the letter, never mentioned it in interviews, but she kept it in her desk drawer. Because in the end, not every moment needed to go viral. Some victories are quiet, and some truths don't shout. They just stand their ground until the country starts listening. The headlines kept spinning. Op-eds, podcasts, primetime specials dissecting every second of her trial. Jasmine Crockett had not just walked out of a courtroom, she had walked into the bloodstream of a national reckoning. But for all the noise, all the applause, all the late-night segments quoting her word for word, she herself remained quiet. Not out of fear, not out of humility, but because she knew what the rest of the country was still struggling to realize. This was never about her. Not really. It was about what happens when the system expects you to fold, and instead, you hold the line. It was about what happens when the truth is inconvenient, unpolished, maybe even unpopular, but you speak it anyway. It was about what happens when you're alone, completely, because that's what the courtroom doesn't show you on camera. It doesn't show you what it feels like when you realize no one is coming to save you. No audience to applaud you, no legal army at your side, no social media team waiting backstage with talking points and a redemption arc. Just you. And the truth. Imagine that for a moment. Really imagine it. You're seated alone at the defense table. Every stare in the room is a loaded weapon. The judge already doubts you. The gallery came not to listen, but to watch you fall. And the people who once stood with you are suddenly, very publicly, silent. Your heart is thudding, not out of fear, but out of calculation. You know what's at stake. You know how quickly 5 seconds of audio can become a sentence. You know how easily clarity can be twisted into arrogance, and how often confidence in someone like you is mistaken for defiance. Now imagine the prosecutor plays a tape, an anonymous voice, 5 clipped seconds, no context, just static and suspicion and silence so loud it shakes the floor beneath you. Now imagine the judge looks at you. You have no script, no mentor, no legal team whispering strategy into your ear. Just a folder and a voice. What do? Do you lower your gaze? Do you wait for someone else to speak? Do you let the lie tighten its grip? Or do you stand? Do you walk forward, step by step, into the silence? Do you open that folder? Do you look that judge in the eye and say, I know what you expected of me, but I came here for the truth? That's what Jasmine did. That's what this story has always been about. Because this isn't just Jasmine's trial. This isn't just about a single courtroom, a single law, or a single piece of clipped evidence. This is about the country we say we are, and the laws we say we live by. It's about how easy it's become to prosecute clarity, to turn discomfort into guilt, to label facts as firebrands and treat directness as disruption. And most of all, it's about how few people are willing to step up when the room expects silence. You think you'll speak when the time comes? You think, when the lie lands at your feet and the crowd leans in, you'll be ready? You won't. Not unless you've prepared for that moment long before it arrives. Because Jasmine didn't win by improvising. She didn't survive by shouting louder. She didn't defend herself with emotion. She came in with the one thing they never expected: preparation wrapped in principle. Law weaponized with restraint. Clarity so sharp it didn't need volume. She walked into that room not just ready to speak, but ready to cut through noise with truth. So now the question's not, was she right? The question is, what would you have done if it were you at that table, with no team, no audience, no editor to fix your pauses, no audience to applaud your tone, just a transcript, a law written decades ago, and 5 seconds of audio that makes you sound like a traitor? Would you fold? Would you shout? Would you run? Or would you do what she did? Would you step forward, calm, clear, and tell the truth anyway? The camera pans away now, not from Jasmine, but toward you. Because this story, it turns out, was never just about her. It was always about the moment when the truth will come for you. When the system will ask, do you still believe in the law when it's inconvenient? Do you still speak clearly when clarity might cost you everything? Do you still show up when no one is watching? And when that moment comes, and it will you rise or will you stay seated? Because Jasmine Crockett didn't win because she had power. She didn't win because she had allies. She won because she had something no one could take from her: the truth and the courage to stand inside it. And now the question isn't about her anymore. It's about you. If tomorrow the seat at that table is yours, what will you bring? What will you say? And most importantly, will you rise? And as the dust settled, as the headlines faded, and the cameras turned to the next scandal, one question remained, whispered not by pundits or politicians, but by the people watching from the quiet corners of the country. What did we just witness? Because this wasn't just a legal victory. It wasn't about sound bites or political chess. This was a moment when the justice system, creaking under the weight of assumption, was forced to pause, to listen, to recalibrate. And at the center of it stood a woman who had every reason to walk away, but didn't. Jasmine Crockett faced down institutional doubt, anonymous sabotage, and centuries of coded silence. And she did it not with rage, not with applause behind her, but with the kind of quiet strength the law was built to protect. That's the human lesson buried beneath the courtroom tension. That truth doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks in alone, unarmed, and still holds the floor. That power, when left unchecked, expects surrender. It anticipates fear. It feeds off silence. But when met with unwavering clarity and unshakable principle, it stalls. It hesitates. It breaks. Jasmine didn't just remind us what the Hatch Act says. She reminded us why it exists. To guard against corruption, not criticism. To shield democracy, not weaponize discomfort. And in doing so, she reminded us that the law must be wielded carefully, or risk becoming a tool of suppression rather than protection. But the deeper truth, the one that lingers long after the transcript is filed and the gallery empties, is that courage is not situational. It's not something we find when we need it. It's something we build. And Jasmine built it long before she ever walked into that courtroom. She built it when no one was looking, when the pressure was quiet and the fear was loud. Her story isn't just a testament to legal brilliance. It's a blueprint for moral resilience, a reminder that justice doesn't demand perfection. It demands presence. It demands that someone stand, even when the floor shakes, even when the verdict is uncertain. So if there's a message here, it's this. You don't need a podium to make a point. You don't need a badge to defend what's right. Sometimes all you need is the truth and the will to carry it forward, even when the world looks away. Because justice isn't guaranteed. It's fought for, quietly, fiercely, one voice at a time. And sometimes all it takes is one person to hold that line. Just one. Just like her. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. A judge insulted and spat on the case file of a poor black woman, never realizing she was Jasmine Crockett, senior legal advisor to the White House. 72 hours later, he was suspended, 6 dismissed cases were reopened, and the entire justice system began to shake. For the first time, the man in power was forced to face real justice. But is this the end, or just the beginning of an even greater reckoning? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. It was just past 8 a.m. when Jasmine Crockett stepped off the train platform into Glen Ridge, an unassuming town with old brick buildings, a courthouse that hadn't seen renovation since the Cold War, and a justice system that was rotting beneath its marble facade. The president had sent her here quietly with one mission: to uncover whether the whispers about corruption, racial bias, and systemic injustice in the local court were more than just rumors. She wasn't here to give speeches or hold press conferences. No motorcade, no entourage. Instead, she wore faded jeans, a wrinkled white button-down, and sneakers that had seen better days. Her hair was pulled back into a loose bun, face bare of makeup, and in her hands she clutched a thick stack of documents. Legal papers, yes, but not the kind people expected from a White House advisor. She looked like any other exhausted single mother desperate for a court date. Just another soul caught in the grinding teeth of the system. And that was the point. Jasmine knew that true power didn't walk through the front door wearing a badge. It slipped in through the side and listened. But just as Jasmine settled into her seat near the filing window, blending in like any other tired civilian seeking justice, a sudden ripple of movement caught her eye. A door creaked open at the far end of the marble hallway, and the sound of hard-soled shoes echoed with unnatural sharpness. Stepping into view was Judge Henry Kemp, towering, square-jawed, his black robe draped over a pristine white shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow as if he were ready to roll up justice itself. He didn't walk. He loomed, shoulders stiff with the authority of a man who had ruled from the bench for over 3 decades and had never once been challenged in his own domain. His face, weathered and pale, bore that unmistakable brand of arrogance that grows from decades of unchecked power. And behind his wire-rimmed glasses, his pale blue eyes swept the room like searchlights looking for an enemy. When he spotted Jasmine sitting quietly, waiting with a folder clutched in her lap, his entire body halted mid-step, like he'd just seen someone crash the gates of his sanctuary. He stared. Not a curious glance, not confusion. A cold, calculated glare, as if her very presence was an offense. And then, without warning, he turned his head toward the nearest security officer and raised his voice for the whole room to hear. "Has anyone run a background check on this woman?" he barked, his finger now pointing toward her like a loaded gun. "She doesn't look like she belongs here." The words exploded into the air like a gunshot in a chapel. Instantly, the already quiet room went dead silent. Papers stopped rustling. Keyboards stopped clicking. Even the overhead lights seemed to hum a little louder. Every single head turned toward Jasmine. Not slowly, not subtly, but all at once, like a scene choreographed in a bad play. Her skin burned beneath their stares. Some were confused, others were amused, a few were outright disgusted. She saw it all in flashes. The wrinkled forehead of a court stenographer, the side-eye from a woman in a sharp skirt suit, the way a man in an old veteran's cap leaned to whisper something to his friend. The whisper was short. The laugh that followed it was not. Across the room, a young mother clutched her toddler tighter on her lap. 2 clerks exchanged glances over the copy machine. A bailiff shifted his weight, resting one hand on the baton at his hip, as if Jasmine had suddenly transformed into a threat. And Jasmine, she sat frozen, not out of fear, but in quiet, measured defiance. Her jaw clenched, her knuckles white against the manila folder in her lap, but her face remained unreadable. Years of courtrooms, depositions, hostile hearings, and closed-door negotiations had trained her to wear masks better than most. She knew if she so much as flinched, she'd give him power. So she stayed still, unmoving, unbothered. A flame disguised as stone. Judge Kemp didn't stop there. "I said, has this woman been screened?" he repeated louder now, eyes locked on the bailiff. "People like her have a tendency to disrupt proceedings." And just like that, the insult turned into something more insidious. He wasn't just questioning her presence. He was labeling her dangerous, painting her as a disruption, a problem, a warning sign. Not because of anything she'd said, not because of anything she'd done, but simply because she was there. Black, female, alone, and unbending. The air around Jasmine had gone dense, like a storm was pressing in on the courthouse walls, but only she could feel it. She stood her ground, steady, professional, her breathing controlled down to the second. Every instinct she had screamed to fire back, to strip this man's arrogance to the bone, but she held it in. Now is not the time. Instead, she calmly extended the folder in her hands toward the filing clerk, her voice even, unwavering. "I'm here to submit a civil complaint under Title 42, Section 1983, violation of civil rights. Everything is in order. All I need is a timestamp and processing confirmation." Her words were textbook precise, delivered without a hint of emotion, but in her chest, her heart was a sledgehammer against her ribs. She had spent her life becoming a fortress against this very moment, trained, seasoned, untouchable. But still, she felt it, the weight of a room waiting for her to break. That's when Judge Henry Kemp did something no one in the building expected, or ever should have seen. He stepped down from the bench, literally. The room seemed to hold its breath as his black judicial robe shifted and flared, with each measured step down the narrow aisle of polished wood. The click of his shoes echoed too sharply, like the sound was trying to punch through the silence. Judges didn't walk into the crowd. Not unless there was a disturbance. Not unless there was danger. And in that moment, he was making it very clear. She was the disturbance. She was the danger. He stopped less than 2 feet from her, close enough for the fluorescent lights to cast shadows under his eyes, making his face look more skeletal than stern. His hands were clasped behind his back in a mock display of civility, but his eyes, those cold, pale eyes, dripped with something else entirely. Not curiosity, not confusion, contempt. This courtroom doesn't waste time with people who think the law is the reason their lives are in ruins, he said, his voice like rust scraping across iron. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp, calculated, the kind of tone a man uses when he's been allowed to speak without consequence for too long. Jasmine didn't flinch, but her jaw clenched slightly just once. He noticed. Of course he did. He took a step closer, violating not just personal space, but professional boundaries with it, and hissed the next line through a twisted half-smile. People like you walk in here thinking you're owed something. Justice, sympathy, what? A redo of all your mistakes? You don't get to rewrite the past just because you filed some fancy paperwork. Around them, the entire courthouse had frozen. A few phones were raised slightly, half-hearted attempts to record without being obvious. A clerk behind the desk pretended to organize files, but her hands were trembling slightly. No one interrupted. No one objected. And that, Jasmine knew, was part of the poison, the silence that makes injustice possible. We don't accept self-made victims here, Kemp said, lowering his voice again, as if it were just between them. Take your accusations and your attitude and walk out that door. Go back to whatever mess you came from. And then came the final blow. He raised one hand, not to strike, but to gesture toward the exit, dismissively, like brushing away an insect. This place isn't meant for people like you. Never was. The words were surgical. They didn't scream. They sliced. They weren't meant to enrage her. They were meant to diminish her, to shrink her into the stereotype he already believed she was. That's how power works when it's unchecked. It whispers with a smirk and waits for you to fall apart in front of witnesses. But Jasmine didn't move, didn't lower her gaze. She stood perfectly still, her fingers still gripping the folder. Not tightly now, not in fear, but with intention. She wasn't going to shout. She wasn't going to defend her worth to a man who had already decided she had none. And yet, even in the stillness that followed, the danger hadn't passed. It was evolving. Because men like Judge Henry Kemp don't retreat when they feel challenged. They escalate. The fact that Jasmine hadn't yelled, hadn't backed down, hadn't shrunk, that she had met his gaze without blinking, wasn't something he could let slide. It was a wound to his ego, a bruise to the authority he wore like a second skin. Jasmine didn't say anything flashy. She didn't need to. Her words were exact, measured, and cut with calm. I have the right to file a civil claim, just like any other citizen in this room. She didn't even raise her voice. But the way she said it, like it was fact and not permission she needed, was enough to make the walls of power around him tremble. Kemp's reaction was instant and volcanic. His face contorted in a way that felt almost primitive, nostrils flaring, jaw twitching, pupils narrowing like a man who'd just been challenged to a duel and didn't know how to win it with dignity. Then his voice exploded. You dare talk back to a judge? The words weren't a question. They were an accusation, laced with disbelief and fury that someone like her would dare to speak in full sentences, let alone claim legal standing. The force of his shout shocked the air out of the room. A file slipped from a clerk's hands. A court officer stiffened by the door. The mood, already tense, went brittle. You could almost hear the oxygen drain from the room. He stepped forward again, no longer restrained by any pretense of professionalism. His black robe billowed slightly with each stomp, making him look more like a predator than a public servant. People watched, frozen, eyes darting between Jasmine and Kemp like spectators at a car crash they couldn't stop. His hand twitched, as if tempted to grab the folder from her, rip it apart, tear through the paper, tear down her. But instead, he did something far worse. He paused. Then he looked her dead in the eye and spit. It wasn't a reflex. It wasn't a slip. It was a choice. Cruel, clear, and calculated. The thick splatter hit the center of her folder, sharp and wet. The sound alone, a slap of contempt, made people flinch. It stained the court's emblem printed on the front page. A trail of spit crawled down the side of the folder, leaking into the corners, soaking the typed ink of official documents now disrespected in the most visceral way. It was an act of defilement, not just of paperwork, but of dignity. It was symbolic, brutal, and utterly intentional. Gas tore through the room, audible, raw, unfiltered. A woman near the exit dropped her purse and didn't move to pick it up. A man in a sheriff's jacket muttered, "Jesus Christ," under his breath. Even those who had laughed earlier, who had nodded along as Kemp mocked her, now stood still, their faces caught somewhere between fear and disbelief. Because what they had just seen, there was no covering it up, no way to soften it. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a temper flare. It was hatred in action. Public, director, cold-blooded. And what did Kemp do next? He didn't flinch. He didn't apologize. He didn't even look embarrassed. He simply squared his shoulders, tugged his robe back into place with a jerk of his arms, turned his back on her, and walked away. His heels clacked against the tile floor like gavel strikes, fading down the hallway with each confident step, leaving behind silence, disgust, and a woman who refused to be broken. Because Jasmine didn't move. She didn't wipe the spit away. She didn't cry. She didn't even look down. Her fingers remained curled around the edges of the folder, soaked and desecrated, but still whole. She stood tall, not out of pride, not out of spite, but out of principle. Her eyes scanned the room once, slowly, not accusing, not pleading, just present, unshaken, bearing witness. And in that courtroom, filled with bystanders, silence, and the fading footsteps of a man who thought he'd won, she became the one thing he never expected. Undeniable. Roughly an hour later, the courthouse intercom crackled to life, its usual monotone announcement carrying an edge of something unfamiliar. Urgency. All court staff, judges, clerks, and legal personnel are required to report to Courtroom 1 immediately for a closed administrative session. Attendance is mandatory. The voice cut off without explanation, leaving behind a hum of confusion. Doors creaked open. Chairs scraped. The hallways buzzed with murmurs and sideways glances. A few staff members traded nervous whispers. "Do you think it's about what happened this morning?" Others pretended not to care, but their hurried footsteps betrayed them. The word federal passed from mouth to mouth like static electricity. Hot, sudden, dangerous. By the time the staff filed into the room, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Kemp had returned to the bench earlier like nothing had happened, his face stone still, his robe immaculate, his ego untouched, or so he wanted it to seem. Now he stood behind a long table at the front of the room, flanked by senior clerks and a visibly uncomfortable district coordinator. The lights overhead were too bright, the AC too cold. It didn't feel like a routine meeting. It felt like a reckoning waiting to land. The bailiffs stood straighter. Junior staff fidgeted with pens, folders, anything to keep their hands from shaking. Kemp scanned the room with the hollow calm of a man who had convinced himself the storm would pass over him untouched. But everyone knew. This wasn't ordinary. This was inspection. And inspections from the federal level didn't come announced like this. Not without a reason. Not unless someone very high up had decided it was time to shine a light on the rot beneath the marble. Still, no one knew who was coming. No one expected what came next. The door opened quietly, but the silence it commanded was thunderous. No one stood. No one spoke. Every head turned. Every eye locked on the woman stepping through the side entrance, like a calm storm about to level the building. She walked slowly, without rush, without the need to assert herself, because real power never begs to be noticed. It just is. Jasmine Crockett had returned, but not as they remembered her. Gone was the denim, the civilian posture, the carefully silenced presence. In its place stood a woman forged in steel and strategy. Her tailored suit, dark slate, pressed sharp, caught the courtroom lights with each step, not flashy, but exact. At her chest hung a polished federal badge clipped to a black lanyard with a seal no one could miss. Executive Office of the President of the United States. Beneath it, in crisp white letters, Jasmine Crockett, Senior Legal Advisor. A single line of text had turned the courtroom into a pressure chamber. People leaned back in their seats. A junior clerk gasped and caught it in her throat. The bailiff who had smirked hours earlier now stood still, face pale. Even Judge Kemp, though stone-faced, betrayed a brief flicker in his eyes. A single frame of recognition that screamed louder than any outburst. The room was caught between disbelief and dread, everyone processing what this meant, what it said about them. Jasmine didn't rush. Her heels clicked against the polished floor in a rhythm that felt like a countdown. She climbed the stairs to the front like she'd stood on hundreds of podiums before, and she had. With calm precision, she placed her folder on the lectern, adjusted the mic once, and scanned the room. Her expression wasn't angry, it wasn't proud, it was anchored, the kind of look only someone who had learned not to flinch under fire could wear. Her voice, when it came, was clear, low, and powerful, not through volume, but through focus. It cut through the heavy air like a blade. Good morning. My name is Jasmine Crockett, Senior Legal Advisor to the White House. The silence cracked, just slightly. Someone shifted. A cough was stifled, but she didn't stop. For the last several weeks, I've been overseeing unannounced evaluations of district courts as part of a federal judicial accountability and reform initiative. Today, that includes this courthouse. Her gaze never wavered. She didn't blink. She didn't soften her words. She wasn't here to soothe egos or offer comfort. She was here to say what no one else had dared. This morning, I entered this building as a private citizen, to observe firsthand how this institution treats those without influence, without status. What I experienced, she let the pause hang, just long enough for every guilty heart in the room to start pounding. It was not justice. That sentence landed like a hammer. Heads dropped, faces flushed. Every eye in the room that had once looked at her with condescension now avoided her completely. People shifted in their seats, some unconsciously pulling their hands into their laps, as if trying to make themselves smaller. Kemp stood rigid, frozen behind his desk, trying to keep the robe from slipping off his illusion of control. But Jasmine wasn't done. She would take her time, because every second she stood there wasn't just a reveal, it was a reckoning. Kemp moved like someone waking from a nightmare, stiff and disoriented, but trying to pretend everything was normal. He adjusted the front of his robe with shaky hands, then rose slowly from his seat. His face twitched into a smile, though it wasn't convincing. It looked more like muscle memory than anything genuine, a reflex born from years of pretending authority equals virtue. His voice cracked before the first word even came out. Ms. Crockett, he began, forcing a cough into his fist. I want to apologize if there's been some sort of misunderstanding. His words were thin, brittle, the voice of a man trying to put out a fire with denial. I wasn't made aware of who you were. But that was all he managed to get out, because Jasmine didn't give him the courtesy of finishing. She stepped forward, not rushed, not aggressive, but deliberate. Every inch she closed was a warning, and when she looked at him, it was not in anger. It was in clarity, the kind that makes a man shrink without a single insult hurled. Her voice cut through the air like a blade gliding through silk. You didn't know who I was, she repeated, not as a question, but as an indictment. Then she tilted her head ever so slightly, her tone dipping just enough to turn sharp. Or did you just never care who anyone was, as long as they didn't look like you? The sentence landed like a slap that echoed in every corner of the room. Kemp blinked, hard. His throat bobbed. Sweat, now forming visibly along his temples, ran down the side of his face unchecked. His mouth opened slightly as if to respond, but no words came. He scanned the room in desperation, eyes flitting from face to face, looking for someone, anyone, who might meet his gaze. But the room had turned on him completely. No one was laughing now. No one nodded. A court officer who had once stood beside him now studied the floor. A clerk stared into her lap, face flushed, eyes filled with something between guilt and disbelief. Even the stenographer had paused her typing. Kemp was utterly alone, and Jasmine knew it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't move closer, but her next words hit with the weight of a verdict. "Judge Kemp," she said, "when you spat on me this morning, you didn't just disgrace yourself. You disgraced the bench. You disgraced this institution. You spit on every single person who ever came into this building, believing that justice still meant something." She turned slightly, addressing not just him now, but the entire room. "You didn't attack me because of what I said. You attacked me because you saw someone you assumed had no power, no name, no worth." Kemp swayed slightly on his feet, as if the room had tilted. His hands gripped the edge of the table behind him, not for support, but as though bracing for the moment the truth finished pulling the ground out from under him. His lips parted, searching for something, anything that could reverse what had just happened. But there was nothing left. No court order, no robe, no booming voice. He had used all of it, wasted it, and now stood in its ashes. Jasmine's gaze stayed locked on his. Her voice, though soft, was unrelenting. "Your mistake wasn't not knowing who I was. Your mistake was thinking it didn't matter." He said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. The courtroom, still frozen, had become something else entirely now. It was no longer a place of routine authority. It was a witness stand, and every person present had just seen the truth testified without needing to be sworn in. One judge, one woman, and a system laid bare between them. And in that brutal, breathtaking silence, it was clearer than ever. Power doesn't make a person untouchable, but integrity, that's what makes someone unforgettable. There was nothing left to argue, nothing left to fake. So Kemp sat, slowly, heavily, quietly. His knees seemed to fold under a weight greater than gravity, the weight of exposure, of public disgrace, of being stripped down in the very space he once ruled without question. The courtroom chair creaked beneath him, but he didn't seem to notice. His arms hung loosely by his sides, like they no longer belonged to him. His spine slouched without the posture of power to hold it up. He blinked once, then again. His gaze didn't move from the wall ahead, but it wasn't looking at the wall. It was looking through it, staring into the wreckage of what came next. Into the silence that follows when you realize you've crossed a line so far behind you that it's not even visible anymore. His lips parted slightly as if to speak, but no words came. Nothing clever, nothing legal, nothing rehearsed. Just breathe. Just silence. He was no longer the voice that commanded the room. He was the warning that silence leaves behind. And Jasmine, she didn't watch him fall. She had already turned, not to gloat, not to bask in victory, but because her work wasn't him. Her work was this room, this system. Everyone who had watched it happen and said nothing. She pivoted cleanly toward the officials seated along the front row, men and women in suits and badges, many of whom had known Kemp for years, shared lunches, shared cases, shared jokes that pushed boundaries, but never drew blood. Until now. Her steps were steady, composed. Her presence had changed. She was no longer the woman they'd laughed at in the hallway that morning, no longer the nobody holding a folder. She was now the reckoning wearing a name tag. She paused at the center of the room, where the air felt like glass, fragile and ready to shatter at any second. Then she spoke. "As of this moment, the Glenridge District Courthouse is officially placed under federal oversight," she announced. Her tone wasn't loud, but it cut through the space like a blade through paper. No one moved. "This decision has been authorized under Section 241 of the Civil Rights Act. A formal investigation is underway, effective immediately." The words landed like thunder. No one interrupted. No one even breathed. Jasmine continued, measured, exact, relentless. "All case files processed under Judge Kemp's supervision will be reviewed. Cases flagged for irregularities, Delays, dismissals under questionable circumstances, they will be re-examined by an independent team. She paused briefly, not for dramatic effect, but to let it sink in. Personnel connected to these cases, whether directly or by inaction, will be questioned under oath. Every decision, every signature, every silence will be accounted for. Now heads began to drop, quietly, carefully. The same officials who once looked at her with smug confidence now avoided her eyes entirely. One clerk visibly winced. Another reached for a water bottle but didn't drink. The room that once held pride now held nothing but guilt. But Jasmine's voice didn't waver. "This review is not about revenge," she said. "It's about restoration. This courtroom is supposed to be a sanctuary for the vulnerable, not a weapon for the powerful. Somewhere along the way, that truth was forgotten, and beginning today, it will be remembered." She took a single breath, controlled, focused, steady. "You may not have spoken when injustice stood next to you, but now you will be required to answer for it." Still, no one looked up. Even Kemp, hunched in his seat, now had one hand raised, not to object, not to fight, but to shield part of his face, as if hiding from the light that had finally come in. And in that moment, Jasmine Crockett didn't just reclaim her dignity, she reclaimed the courtroom. But Jasmine knew words alone wouldn't be enough. Not here, not now. Power hides behind records, so she brought receipts. With a calm flick of her hand, she pulled out a slim wireless remote and pressed a single button. The courtroom lights dimmed ever so slightly, and a large screen on the wall behind her hummed to life. No introduction, no commentary, just data. The first slide appeared, a clean, color-coded bar graph titled Civil Case Dismissal Rates by Race. Glenridge District Court, 2018 to 2023. The numbers weren't subtle, they screamed. One bar, representing white plaintiffs, stood high in green. The other, black plaintiffs, was thin, short, and bleeding red. Side by side, the disparity was undeniable. Anegihes egi retoskodesi arani. Gasps didn't erupt. They leaked. Quiet, restrained disbelief. A court clerk in the third row blinked hard. A junior paralegal scribbled something, then stopped halfway, pen shaking. Jasmine spoke, not dramatically, not emotionally, but with that precise tone prosecutors use when they already know the verdict. Black citizens filing civil complaints in this courthouse over the last 5 years were 4 times more likely to have their cases dismissed, regardless of merit, evidence, or urgency. She let that hang, then clicked to the next slide. Case samples, dozens. Each one listed with filing dates, plaintiff demographics, summary of allegations, and judge presiding. In nearly every instance, the outcome was the same: dismissed. In the margin of each, a note. Judge of record, H. Kemp. Jasmine didn't stop. These aren't just numbers. These are stories that never got told, injuries that never got acknowledged, children whose school rights were ignored, families evicted without due process. These were not bad cases. They were ignored cases, silenced cases. And the silence wasn't accidental. It was administrative. The room had stopped blinking. She clicked again. This time, the screen displayed a list. 12 complaint case numbers, each one followed by a label in bold. Filed against Judge Henry Kemp. The dates spanned nearly a decade. The allegations ranged from racial profiling to verbal abuse to procedural tampering. Every case followed by the same note. Resolved internally, no further action. She turned away from the screen. Now it was just her, the silence, and the weight of what could no longer be denied. 12 official complaints, not anonymous letters, not rumors, formal, written accusations, filed through proper legal channels with documentation, and every one of them, every single one, was closed without action. No hearings, no investigations, no consequences. Then with the gravity of a final gavel strike, you know what you call that? Not coincidence, not backlog, not clerical error. You call that complicity. Several officials shifted uncomfortably. One man seated near the back in a gray suit ran his hand over his mouth and avoided her eyes entirely. A woman in a navy blazer lowered her head, suddenly very interested in her own lap. No one spoke, not even Kemp. His hands remained limp at his sides. His breathing was shallow, almost rhythmic, like he was trying to disappear without moving. But Jasmine was still standing, still speaking, still making sure no one looked away this time. This court has not only failed to serve the people of this community, it has systematically betrayed them, covered for itself, and punished those who dared ask why. She looked directly at the officials seated in the front row, those with titles, salaries, and years of silence behind them. Starting today, that betrayal ends, because this building will no longer be a shield for cowards. It will become what it was supposed to be, a place of truth, and that begins with accountability. And with those words, the silence didn't return. It fractured. But exposure doesn't guarantee transformation, only resistance. And now the whispers began. They didn't confront her directly. Cowards rarely do. But in the hours that followed her announcement, as staff filed out in small fractured groups, the muttering started, low and venomous, just beneath the surface. Behind closed office doors and clustered break rooms, voices sharpened into criticism. "She's making a spectacle," one senior court administrator murmured to a colleague, glancing down the hallway to make sure no one was listening. "Dragging us through the mud for political points," said another, a middle-aged attorney whose desk was lined with framed certificates but no record of ever speaking up. Others were more subtle, half jokes, sighs too loud to be innocent, or polite conversations that stopped abruptly whenever Jasmine passed by. In their minds, she hadn't pulled back the curtain on injustice. She had pulled down the whole theater, and that terrified them. They framed her actions not as bravery, but betrayal. "She's attacking the judiciary," one clerk whispered, her tone clipped. "Undermining public trust, making it look like we're all corrupt." A prosecutor leaned against a file cabinet, arms crossed, voice low but sharp. "She didn't come here for reform. She came here for headlines." The irony was suffocating. The very people who had turned away in silence while injustice festered now found their voices to defend the institution, not from abuse, but from accountability. Jasmine became the problem, not the data, not the 4-1 dismissals, not the 12 buried complaints. Her truth was too loud for their comfort, so they tried to muffle it with cowardice, dressed as professionalism. But Jasmine heard them. She always did. Because when you stand for something real, they don't stab you in the chest. They try to silence you with smiles. And in Glenridge, the backlash wasn't fire. It was frost. But the courtroom wasn't the only battlefield. Outside its walls, the narrative was already unraveling across headlines and hashtags. Within 24 hours, Glenridge was no longer just a sleepy courthouse. It was national news. Local media outlets scrambled to cover the fallout, but their tones split like fault lines. One conservative-leaning station aired footage of Jasmine's speech, heavily cropped, of course, and titled the segment "Federal Overreach or Political Theater." D.C. lawyer disrupts small-town court. The anchor, with a carefully neutral voice, asked if her actions were grandstanding for attention and damaging public confidence in the judiciary. Online, a columnist wrote that Jasmine had humiliated a respected judge and called her an outsider with an agenda. The comment section roared with vitriol. She came to destroy, not fix. Typical race baiting from a D.C. lawyer. This is what happens when activists dress like professionals. But not every outlet followed that script. One independent news blog ran a front-page headline in bold, "She said it. She proved it. She shook the system." Another featured interviews with plaintiffs whose cases had been dismissed under Kemp's court. People who, for the first time, were being asked what happened to them instead of why they lost. A young reporter, live outside the courthouse, said flatly into the mic, "It's not every day someone walks into a building full of secrets and turns the lights on." Jasmine Crockett just did that. Social media lit up in parallel universes. In one, she was a fraud. In the other, a fighter. Some called for her resignation. Others wanted her to run for office. The truth didn't matter to everyone, but it mattered enough. Jasmine didn't flinch, because she knew that real change doesn't come with applause. It comes with fire, and you walk through it or you don't walk at all. And as the public's attention deepened, so did the desperation from those exposed. Kemp wasn't done, not yet. 3 days after the courtroom confrontation, a press conference was called outside his private law office, away from the courthouse, flanked by a hastily printed banner and two stone-faced attorneys. Cameras clicked. Reporters murmured. Then Kemp stepped up to the podium, looking thinner, paler, but still armed with the arrogance of a man who had never been held accountable. His voice cracked slightly at the beginning, but grew louder as he spoke, not with confidence, but with practiced outrage. What happened in that courtroom was not justice, he began, eyes sweeping over the cameras like a man auditioning for sympathy. It was entrapment, a stunt, a setup. He tightened his grip on the podium, leaning forward like a cornered animal, pretending to roar. I did not know who Ms. Crockett was when she entered that building. She presented herself deceptively. She baited me. The words hit the air like gasoline, waiting for a spark. Some reporters blinked in disbelief. Others took notes, dead-eyed, already sensing the spin. Kemp went on, voice rising. This wasn't about truth. It was political theater. I've served this community for over 30 years. I have given my life to this court, and now because I refuse to entertain a baseless claim filed by someone hiding their identity, my reputation is being destroyed in the media. He paused, trying to breathe, but the sweat on his brow betrayed him. This is not accountability. It's assassination. Professional, personal, and public. But what Kemp didn't realize, what he still couldn't grasp, was that the cameras weren't protecting him anymore. They were documenting him. His words didn't sway the truth. They magnified the denial. They exposed the entitlement. And as clips of his statement circulated online, side by side with Jasmine's speech and DOJ statistics, the contrast became unbearable to ignore. He hadn't cleared his name. He'd carved it into the wall of everything Jasmine had come to tear down. Kemp's denial echoed through headlines for 2 days. But the Department of Justice didn't waste time debating narrative. It moved on evidence. At 6:07 a.m. on a Monday morning, long before the courthouse doors opened, the DOJ's Office of Civil Rights released a formal statement to every major outlet in the region. It was cold, unapologetic. A scalpel, not a speech. The first line alone stopped readers mid-sentence. As of this morning, Judge Henry Kemp is placed under immediate suspension, pending investigation into allegations of judicial misconduct, procedural violations, and civil rights infractions. No qualifiers, no softened language, just cause and consequence. The announcement confirmed that 6 civil cases previously closed under Kemp's authority were being reopened for full federal review. These weren't vague claims. They were attached to specific docket numbers, plaintiff names, and documented irregularities. By noon, reporters were camped outside the courthouse steps. DOJ officials in Navy suits and worn briefcases entered through the side entrance. Inside, marshals discreetly escorted court staff to closed-door interviews. Kemp's nameplate was removed from his office door, not shattered, not dramatic, but methodically unscrewed and boxed away, as if it had never belonged there. The air in the building had changed. It was heavier now, quieter. Secretaries typed slower. Phones were answered with tighter voices. Even those who had once mocked Jasmine in hushed conversations avoided the break room entirely. The building felt like it had been caught breathing in and didn't dare exhale. And those 6 cases, they weren't just numbers in a report anymore. They had faces, stories. One plaintiff, a middle-aged black mother whose housing discrimination suit had been thrown out without hearing, told a local journalist, "When they tossed my case, it felt like I was being erased. Now it feels like someone finally saw me." Another, a factory worker who'd sued for wrongful termination after blowing the whistle on racial slurs at work, simply said, "I never thought I'd get another shot. I thought justice had moved on without me." Jasmine watched all of it unfold, not from a podium, not from a spotlight, but from the back of the courtroom, seated quietly with a notepad in her lap. She wasn't here to perform. She was here to witness the consequence of truth. Every officer she passed now greeted her with a nod, not out of fear, but recognition, because the system had cracked, and she had been the wedge. But she didn't smile. Not yet, because a suspension wasn't justice. A reopened case wasn't a conviction. It was just the first inch forward in a marathon of repair. And in that moment, as investigators moved through the hallways with clipboards and sealed folders, Jasmine understood something deeper than headlines or praise. Real justice doesn't happen when the cameras are rolling. It happens when systems are finally forced to turn around and look at themselves. But justice doesn't end with exposure. It begins again with responsibility. Jasmine understood that. She knew the headlines would fade, the cameras would eventually leave. But the harm done inside those courtrooms, the lives derailed, the voices silenced, the dignity crushed under routine indifference, that would linger unless something real replaced the rot. So on a gray Tuesday morning, under the glass dome of the Glenridge courthouse, Jasmine called a press conference, not to speak of what had been broken, but to announce what would be built in its place. The rotunda was packed. Reporters lined the back wall. Community leaders, court staff, even a few plaintiffs from the reopened cases stood along the marble pillars. The tension was thick, but there was something else underneath it now. Something new. Anticipation. Jasmine stepped up to the podium, a thin stack of papers in one hand, a steel resolve in the other. She wore no smile, no makeup for the cameras, just a charcoal gray suit and the badge of the Office of the White House Counsel pinned firmly over her heart. Her voice, when it came, was steady, but carried the weight of every name, every file, every unheard plea. What happened in this courthouse wasn't just misconduct, it was cultural, systemic, baked into daily routines and protected by silence. That silence ends today. She paused, just long enough for everyone to sit up straighter. Effective immediately, we are establishing the Glenridge Independent Oversight Commission. She let the words ring, then broke them down. This panel will be made up of veteran civil rights attorneys, retired judges with no ties to this circuit, and community representatives selected by public nomination. Their job will not be ceremonial, it will be surgical. She clicked a remote. Behind her, a screen lit up with the structure of the commission. Names, roles, responsibilities, deadlines. The room murmured. The weight of what she was building began to register. This body will have access to every courtroom proceeding, every dismissal, every sentence. They will track patterns of bias, document disparities, and issue quarterly reports directly to the Department of Justice, not the clerk's office, not a back room, public, transparent, permanent. She didn't blink. She didn't soften her voice. She wasn't asking for support. She was issuing a directive. This courthouse will no longer be governed by reputation. It will be governed by results, and results will be measured by fairness, not fear. A pause, then she took one small step closer to the mic and delivered the line that would be quoted for weeks. A courtroom is not a stage for power. It is a sanctuary for trust. It didn't need applause. It landed like a gavel. In the silence that followed, you could feel the shift. Not celebration, accountability finally taking root. Journalists scribbled notes faster. A community organizer in the back wiped her eyes. A former court translator stood still with his arms folded, nodding just once. Jasmine stepped back, lowered her folder, and didn't speak again. Because the most powerful part had already been said. 6 months had passed since the Glenridge courthouse underwent its seismic transformation, and every echo of the old system seemed more distant each day. The marble floors, once a cold reminder of bureaucratic indifference, now gleamed with renewed purpose as staff hurried between offices, carrying folders they actually meant to read. Posters on the walls invited citizens to attend community feedback sessions, promising that any voice raised in good faith would be heard. Where tension and frustration once lingered, a cautious sense of optimism took root, like grass sprouting through cracked pavement. New interns, bright-eyed and restless, shadowed seasoned legal aides who refused to let important cases slip away under piles of paperwork. The hush that used to blanket the corridors had been replaced by the low, energetic hum of people actually collaborating, exchanging ideas about fairer practices and streamlined processes. At times, it felt like witnessing the birth of a new institution, one determined to succeed where its predecessor had failed. Of course, a system steeped in decades of bias could not reinvent itself overnight, but these early months suggested that genuine progress, however fragile, had begun. And at the heart of it all remained the steadfast presence of Jasmine Crockett, whose quiet vigilance kept the momentum alive. From the outside, the courthouse looked much the same. An austere, neoclassical facade framed by towering columns, drab walls rising toward a sky that shifted from stormy gray to pale blue on any given day. But inside, the changes were impossible to miss, especially for those who had known the building's old ways. For one thing, visitors were no longer stopped by bored receptionists with icy stares. They were greeted by a newly appointed welcome coordinator, a calm, middle-aged woman who took pride in handing out pamphlets on available legal services. If a tenant was on the verge of eviction, she would direct them to the free legal aid clinic. If someone needed to file a civil rights complaint, she would offer guidance rather than suspicious glances. The shift from obstruction to assistance felt almost surreal, as if some invisible hand had flipped the moral compass of the entire building. Observers noticed that the walls had been repainted in lighter tones, subtle but noticeable, and the harsh fluorescent lights had been replaced with softer LEDs that gave the corridors a warmer glow. No one claimed these superficial adjustments solved the deeper problems, but they hinted at a willingness to move away from the cold austerity of the past. At every turn, you could sense an institutional hunger for redemption, even if some remnants of the old guard still grumbled behind closed doors. Among the most visible innovations was the expanded roster of pro bono legal specialists, young attorneys eager to prove themselves, and seasoned lawyers who had grown tired of private practice and wanted to serve a greater cause. They worked hand in hand with social workers and community advocates, forming rapid response teams for urgent cases like unlawful evictions, workplace discrimination, or even simple disputes that could be mediated before spiraling into costly trials. Their offices were located right off the main lobby in a space once used for overflow storage. Now it was bustling with the chatter of dedicated professionals drafting affidavits, scheduling hearings, and making phone calls to neglected claimants who had once been dismissed as nuisances. Each day, they posted the number of citizens they helped on a whiteboard, an act of transparency that sparked optimism among passers-by. Clerks who had long been jaded found themselves re-energized by this new atmosphere of genuine engagement. It became standard practice for attorneys to step outside their offices to greet clients personally, guiding them through the labyrinth of legal procedure that once felt like a cruel puzzle. Even skeptics couldn't deny the tangible results. Fewer cases were being tossed out on technicalities, and more disputes were resolved with fair settlements before reaching trial. As word spread throughout the community, foot traffic at the courthouse soared, not because people suddenly loved filing legal forms, but because they believed the system might actually work in their favor now. Such hope had been a rare commodity just half a year ago. Meanwhile, the mandatory ethics and bias training sessions had become the new battleground for minds still resistant to change. Scheduled once a week in the courthouse's largest conference room, these workshops were led by retired judges, civil rights attorneys, and even local activists who had once been branded as agitators. At first, attendance felt forced. Staff slouched in chairs, crossing their arms, rolling their eyes, or muttering about bureaucratic overreach. Yet something shifted after the second or third session, when participants were asked to confront real-life scenarios pulled directly from Glenridge's own records. Cases where a tenant was evicted due to a hidden bias, or a mother's custody plea was ignored because of assumptions about her background. These stories were no longer abstract. They reflected what had happened under the very roof where they now sat. Slowly, arms uncrossed, posture straightened, and some staffers began taking notes with genuine concern rather than passive compliance. A few bold souls even raised their hands to share personal experiences, admitting they'd looked the other way when Kemp pushed through questionable rulings. It wasn't a neat narrative where everyone held hands by the end, but you could see seeds of self-awareness taking root in people who once treated bias as someone else's problem. Beyond training, the courthouse introduced quarterly town hall meetings, a concept that made many of the old guard grimace in disbelief. Civic leaders, activists, and everyday citizens packed the newly repurposed assembly hall, an airy room on the second floor that had previously housed musty file cabinets. At each gathering, a microphone stood at the front, and anyone could step up, voice their concerns, and receive an on-the-spot response from the panel of administrators and attorneys. Some nights, the room erupted with passionate pleas, a father demanding to know why his child's case dragged on for months, a young woman furious her harassment complaint hadn't been taken seriously. Tension crackled in the air, but staff and officials were expected to respond with transparency rather than defensiveness. Over time, these sessions evolved from confrontational spectacles into collaborative discussions. By their fourth meeting, community members began suggesting constructive improvements. A local pastor proposed a mediation hotline, an educator offered to run literacy clinics for pro-SE litigants, and a group of concerned parents volunteered to translate court documents into multiple languages. Suddenly, the courthouse wasn't just a fortress of verdicts. It became a breeding ground for new ideas that might reshape how justice was experienced, rather than merely dispensed. People left those town halls both exhausted and invigorated, carrying a sense that change, while messy, was undeniably happening. As for Jasmine, she stayed busy ensuring that every reform was more than just lip service. Each morning, she arrived before most staff, greeting the new arrivals, some starry-eyed, some uncertain, while scanning the day's docket for any red flags. She'd make unannounced visits to different departments, gently reminding them that accountability did not stop at a press release. Sometimes she watched hearings from the back of the courtroom, quietly observing how judges questioned the parties, how attorneys presented evidence, and how clerks facilitated paperwork. The moment she sensed old habits creeping back, files lost, attorneys ignored, or plaintiffs dismissed with a sneer, she'd jot down notes and request immediate follow-up from her oversight team. Her presence was never loud or intimidating. It was simply constant, like the hum of electricity that keeps the lights on. Despite inevitable pushback, her authority was respected in ways that made it clear she had transcended any label of outsider. The courthouse had, in a strange twist, become her domain, a place where she fought not for power, but for a system that worked for everyone. Even those who secretly resented her influence had to concede the positive changes, if only grudgingly. Still, the path was anything but smooth. Whisper campaigns occasionally flared up, accusations that Jasmine's reforms were too stringent, that they slowed down vital procedures, or bred paranoia about every decision being second-guessed. A few senior judges privately moaned to colleagues that the courthouse felt like a fishbowl, with every ruling monitored by the Oversight Commission. And indeed, the commission, composed of retired judges, civil rights lawyers, and community representatives, was relentless in its scrutiny, demanding case reviews and requesting data on judge performance metrics that no one had bothered to track before. Tensions rose during closed-door sessions where certain staff felt attacked or singled out, leading to heated arguments that spilled into hallways. Yet, ironically, these very disputes served as proof that transparency was working. It forced issues into the open instead of letting them fester in secrecy. Over time, skepticism began to fade, replaced by a begrudging acceptance that perhaps the days of rubber-stamping justice were over. Those who couldn't adapt resigned or retired early, leaving vacancies filled by a new generation of professionals eager to be part of something real, something they could take pride in. The cultural shift, while incomplete, had woven itself into the daily operations, like the slow but unstoppable turning of a tide. By now, 6 months felt both fleeting and monumental, an awkward adolescence in the life of an institution trying to outgrow decades of wrongdoing. The Glenridge Courthouse was far from perfect, but each day brought fresh victories. A fair settlement reached swiftly, an immigrant family offered translation services without delay, a survivor of discrimination receiving sincere apologies instead of dismissals. Local newspapers ran a few positive headlines, marveling at the miracle in Glenridge, while radio talk shows debated whether the transformation would hold once the spotlight moved on. Jasmine, for her part, remained steady at the helm, refusing to be swept away by praise or worn down by criticism. Sometimes, after a long day, she'd linger in the main corridor, gazing at the swirl of humanity passing through. The bailiff offering directions with a polite nod, the paralegal loading a cart full of documents to deliver to the free legal clinic, the tearful litigant stepping out of a hearing with genuine relief on her face. Each moment reaffirmed why she'd stepped into this fight, why she'd confronted a judge who spat on her, why she'd risked her own reputation to spark a revolution of simple, tangible decency. Because in every victory, no matter how small, one truth shone through. Justice, when treated with respect, can change the heart of a place and maybe even the soul of its people. And that was enough to keep her pushing forward, fueled by a sense of duty that transcended any temporary headlines or fleeting controversies. And yet, even in the midst of cautious optimism and evolving policies, there remained moments that truly embodied the spirit of a reformed Glenridge courthouse. One such moment arrived when an elderly woman, thin, stooped, her hair caught in a loose bun, walked through the lobby doors, clutching a battered envelope of evidence. She had been turned away 3 separate times in the past, her complaints about predatory housing contracts waved off by dismissive clerks who saw only her frail body, her worn clothes, and her quavering voice. This time, she was greeted by a newly hired intake specialist who did not so much as blink at her age or appearance before directing her to the free legal aid desk. Within minutes, she was seated in a small conference room, detailing the shady tactics of her landlord to an attentive attorney who promised swift action. Overhearing the exchange, 2 paralegals offered to expedite her paperwork, cutting what might once have been a month-long delay down to less than a week. It was not a grand gesture. There were no cameras and no speeches. But for her, it was everything. When she left that room, tears of relief sparkled in her eyes, as if a weight she'd carried alone for years had finally been lifted. Outside, she paused to absorb the change in atmosphere, marveling that the courthouse, once the source of her deepest discouragement, might now hold the key to restoring her dignity. As her case progressed with unprecedented efficiency, word spread through the corridors that the old lady with the envelope had already been assigned a hearing date. News of this transformation filtered in whispers from one clerk to another, fueling conversations about how far the courthouse had come in only half a year. Some of the more senior staff, accustomed to seeing people like her brushed aside, wore astonished expressions as they watched official documents move through the system at record speed. The younger employees simply smiled, proud to witness the fruits of reforms they had been working towards since Jasmine Crockett arrived. It was under that changed dynamic that a small assembly was scheduled in the main lobby, a subdued but symbolic occasion to commemorate the courthouse's newfound direction and to highlight the individuals who had persevered through early skepticism. Ornate chairs were arranged in a semicircle, and a modest podium stood at the center, flanked by tall windows that let in beams of midday sunlight. A sense of guarded celebration filled the air, not triumphant, but hopeful, as though everyone recognized the distance they had yet to travel. Some members of the Oversight Commission chatted quietly, exchanging final notes on upcoming reviews and training sessions. And in the background, as staff mingled and waited for the brief ceremony to begin, the old woman herself quietly sorted her newly printed forms, her face betraying both gratitude and a lingering disbelief that justice might finally work in her favor. The assembly commenced with a few words from the chief clerk, who acknowledged the tremendous effort put forth by both veterans of the courthouse and newcomers seeking to implement more humane policies. But the true highlight arrived when a young attorney took the podium, a woman who couldn't have been more than a few years out of law school, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with emotion. She spoke about the intimidation she had once felt stepping into a field dominated by cynicism, where lofty ideals of fairness could be crushed under procedural shortcuts and hushed biases. "I almost quit in my first year," she admitted, gaze flickering across the assembly, lingering on older attorneys who nodded in empathy. Then she singled out Jasmine Crockett, who stood to the side, blending into the small crowd with characteristic understatement. "If it wasn't for you, Ms. Crockett," the young lawyer continued, her words slicing through the gentle hum of the air conditioning, "I'd never have found the courage to keep going." A stunned hush fell over the group, each person aware of the weight behind her confession, the exhaustion, the disillusionment, the near surrender to a system that often devoured idealists. Jasmine, expression earnest, gave a barely perceptible nod as if to say, "I'm simply doing what must be done." Somehow the silence that followed felt fuller than any applause might have, because in that pause, the collective heartbreak of what had been lost met the stubborn hope of what was now possible. Afterward, clusters of staff, attorneys, and citizens mingled in the corridor, discussing everything from upcoming ethics reviews to the old woman's promising legal progress. A paralegal confided that she'd once turned away 3 people in a single day under Judge Kemp's reign, citing insufficient documentation when really she'd just been told to keep the backlog low. Another shared a memory of rushing to finalize dismissals on flimsy grounds because that was how the system operated before transparency took root. Yet now that culture of fear and helplessness had cracked, replaced by an imperfect but sincere determination to do better. As for Jasmine, she listened more than she spoke, gently guiding conversations toward solutions rather than dwelling on blame. She lingered near the young attorney who'd praised her, exchanging a few hushed words of encouragement before excusing herself to greet new volunteers from a local law school. In one corner of the hall, the old woman clutched her envelope of documents with a look of fierce pride, determined to see her case through. It was that sight, that quiet resolve in someone who had once been dismissed 3 times, that underscored the true impact of what had transpired in Glenridge. And while the path forward was long and winding, on this day it felt as though, for the first time in years, the courthouse had finally chosen to walk alongside its people rather than stand in their way. When the day's proceedings ended, a hush fell across the lobby, as though every voice had paused for Jasmine's final words. She lifted her gaze, scanning a crowd of clerks, lawyers, and citizens, each face caught between hope and lingering doubt. In a voice free of arrogance, yet demanding to be heard, she gave them the truth they needed. "The law cannot be fair if those who enforce it forget the worth of every human being," she said, eyes unwavering. "And justice does not live in a judge's chair. It resides in the actions of those who dare to speak, who endure scorn to change the system." Her words sliced through the tension like a razor, proving no black robe or lofty title could claim moral high ground while trampling the very people it was meant to protect. She paused, letting the echoes settle along the marble walls, daring everyone to reckon with what they had allowed. Her statement was not a flourish, but a challenge. Stand for what is right or remain complicit in comfortable silence. In that quiet moment, Glenridge felt less like a courthouse and more like a testament to how courage can reshape an entire world. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.